One very lucky survivor of Thursday's earthquake in Iran, but 30 to 40,000 didn't make it.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw, reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. The numbers are staggering and the rescue work is overwhelming in the provinces of northern Iran, where one of the worst earthquakes of this century killed between 30 and 40,000 people. More than 6,000 people have been pulled alive from the rubble, but the real story is death and destruction, not survival. NBC's Don Oliver tonight in London, where he's been tracking all the earthquake developments.
The dead are everywhere. They were killed when whole blocks of buildings were turned into unrecognizable heaps of splinters, mud, and stone. Lacking heavy equipment, the men of the devastated village of Manjil dig with their hands and shovels. And amid all the death, they find life. A villager buried in the ruins of his mud home for more than 36 hours, but still alive. Carefully, they ease him out. The man appears dazed, uncomprehending. Iranian officials say there have been thousands of dramatic rescues like this, but many more thousands of deaths. This man's wife and a daughter were with him in the house. They were found dead. This woman cries for her son and daughter, both killed in the earthquake. The threat of disease has forced the digging of mass graves. An estimated 400,000 Iranians are homeless. No water, no electricity, little food. President Hashemi Rafsanjani toured one of the battered provinces, promising aid. The government says it doesn't need rescue workers or doctors from the outside. But with the exceptions of South Africa and Israel, it will accept emergency supplies from other countries, even one it calls the Great Satan, the United States. In Connecticut today, a private aid group called AmeriCare was readying medical supplies, even though there were some misgivings.
AmeriCare tries not to discriminate against anything, and it seems to me that the Iranians have discriminated, particularly when it comes to the Americans.
The U.S. government says it will channel aid through the International Red Cross, and Iran is going to need all the help it can get to recover from this disaster. Don Oliver, NBC News, London.
From South Africa tonight, there is word of a possible right-wing plot to assassinate Nelson Mandela and South African President F.W. de Klerk. Police questioned 11 white men, then released them pending further investigation. De Klerk's dialogue with Mandela and the cancellation of some apartheid laws have angered white conservatives in that country. Mandela, winding up his New York visit, called de Klerk a man of integrity as he took his cause today to the United Nations. Mandela thanked the United Nations for its help in fighting apartheid, which he called a crime against humanity. What is not so well known is that Mandela and the ANC are being helped as well by the PLO's Yasser Arafat, Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, Cuba's Fidel Castro, each accused by this country of supporting terrorism. Last night, in an interview, Mandela defended those ties.
There is no reason whatsoever why we should have any hesitation about hailing their commitment to human rights as they are being demanded in South Africa. They are placing resources at our disposal for us to win the fight.
And for Mandela, one of the major weapons in that struggle is economic pressure on the South African government, sanctions, keeping many Western businesses out of South Africa. However, as NBC's chief financial correspondent Mike Jensen reports tonight, Mandela also is thinking about future investment in his country.
Keep the pressure on! Keep the pressure on! Keep the pressure on!
Keep the pressure on. They're talking about sanctions, refusal by companies to do business with white South Africa. Mandela supporters even covered the signs of American companies that still deal with South Africa. Later, Mandela's plea, keep up the pressure. It's working.
Sanctions must therefore be kept in place until fundamental and irreversible changes take place in our troubled country.
But what's working politically is not working economically. While Mandela is picking up checks to help finance the struggle, South Africa's economy has been crippled by sanctions. And there's another problem, Mandela's strategy for the future. Nationalization of South Africa's mining industry, financial institutions, and other large companies.
We are prepared to adopt any action, even though it might hurt our economy.
That scares business leaders. Today, Mandela met with a group of them. He'll need their money when trade resumes. They floated the idea of a development bank to help South Africa.
American companies, American foundations could be involved in development projects, maybe even entrepreneurial new business startups.
But that's small potatoes. Businessmen say privately that no matter how much they admire Mandela, they won't risk big corporate dollars in South Africa until they know their investment will be safe. Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
Monday at the White House, Mandela will be talking about the importance of sanctions with President Bush. Also coming up here tonight on NBC Nightly News, exclusive details from NBC News on prescription drugs being ripped off from the Medicaid program.
Let's go. Oh, my God!
And come take a ride with us on the wildest roller coasters in the country. NBC's George Lewis on the roller coaster comeback in America.
More fiber.
There is a new scandal tonight involving government money, narcotics and other prescription drugs bought at low Medicaid rates ending up in the black market at much higher prices. NBC's Robert Hager has obtained documents that spell out how this program for the poor is being ripped off, and he has these exclusive details.
The unpublished government report says the program is being bilked of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of prescription drugs a year. Instead of going to the poor, the report says these drugs are diverted to illegal traffickers for resale on the streets at black market prices totaling billions of dollars nationally. These pictures, made by a hidden news camera in New York, show 50 people masquerading as patients lined up to get drugs from a licensed physician at what they jokingly admitted was a pill mill.
The report obtained by NBC News is from the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, Richard Kusro. And in it, he calls for a national initiative to crack down on the problem.
At issue, the prescription drugs in demand by junkies: Valium, Xanax, codeine, and others. Dishonest doctors and pharmacies can order huge quantities at government expense. On the street, $50 worth of Valium can bring a seller $250. $50 of Dilaudid can bring $8,000. Already, the report says, Medicaid records in Philadelphia show 530 doctors prescribing abnormal amounts of suspect drugs. In Maryland, 349 pharmacies have been found to have aberrant prescription patterns. In New Mexico, where 1,100 doctors participate in Medicaid, one doctor alone was found prescribing 28% of all the Valium dispensed under the program statewide. Former Secretary of Health, Joseph Califano.
What it does is it turns the Medicaid program into a drug pusher with the taxpayers' money.
Some 200 doctors and druggists are arrested each year, but there may be thousands ripping off the system. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
More rip-offs. The savings and loan scandal could cost $500 billion, but in Washington, the big question still is who gets the blame. Today, the president and his congressional critics gave a preview of the positions that they'll be taking to the voters later this year. More on that now from NBC's John Cochran.
Trying to deflect charges that he has pussyfooted on SNL fraud, President Bush told federal prosecutors from all over the country to intensify their efforts.
We will not rest until the cheats and the chiselers and the charlatans spend a large chunk of their lives behind the bars of a federal prison.
Democrats, smelling blood on the SNL issue, accused Bush of using federal attorneys as props for a photo op.
And I don't know what it costs to fly all those U.S. attorneys in here, but I assume it cost a fair amount. I don't think they got a thing done.
Bush did promise to give prosecutors more help, including more investigators. Democrats fired back that the new Bush plan is a rehash of the one unveiled by his own Justice Department last December, which also called for more investigators.
The president told us today that he was going to hire 202 FBI agents. On December 7th, Attorney General Thornburg said on page 4 of his release, a total of 202 FBI agents.
Democrats think the president is vulnerable partly because his son Neil is under investigation as a former director of a bankrupt thrift firm. Republicans say Democrats are desperate for an issue.
And some slick consultants believe it's the best way to proceed is to attack President Bush. And the best way to take on President Bush with a record-breaking popularity and job approval rating is to somehow go after him on an SNL matter.
Both parties have suddenly discovered that voters are angry about the SNL fiasco and will be angrier if asked to pay for it with higher taxes. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
And there was a controversial government decision today on a controversial environmental issue. In order to save the northern spotted owl from extinction, the federal government today put it on the list of threatened species. That could mean an end to logging on 3 million acres in 3 northwestern states. NBC's Jim Cummins tonight.
The northern spotted owl, it weighs less than 2 pounds. There are an estimated 6,000 of them in the Pacific Northwest. 2,000 acres of old-growth forest, at least 40,000 trees are needed to give one pair of these birds room to survive. In the contest of the owl versus the loggers lost. It takes just 90 seconds to cut down one of these 400-year-old trees. Environmentalists say the trees as well as the owl are threatened.
In 5 to 10 years at current rates of cutting in the Pacific Northwest, the ancient forests are going to be completely gone.
But the economic impact of today's decision could be staggering. 30,000 jobs in the timber industry could be lost. Now dozens of timber towns like Sweet Home, Oregon are on a different threatened species list. A third of the businesses here have already closed.
We're the ones that's going to suffer in this whole thing. We're the ones losing our jobs, our homes, our families are being split up.
There's more at stake here than just saving the spotted owl. Environmentalists are fighting to preserve these old-growth forests. Some of them have trees up to 1,000 years old. Now the government must decide what economic impact the protection of the owl will have on the people who earn their living from these ancient trees. Jim Cummins, NBC News, Sweet Home, Oregon.
And environmentalists say this problem is global. Wildlife habitat is being wiped out by development. 40,000 American women will die just this year because of breast cancer, and many of those lives could have been saved by early detection by mammograms. However, as we have been reporting here all this week, not all mammograms are reliable. Tonight in her final report, Michelle Gillen tells us how to make sure that your mammogram is a good one.
When Ann Moore got married, life seemed full of promise. And then at 23, she discovered the lump in her right breast.
And I was told that it was a gland, and it was nothing to be concerned about.
For 7 years, her doctors in Springfield, Massachusetts, palpated the lump, touched it, but never ordered a mammogram or other diagnostic test. Once she told her doctor she was having trouble breastfeeding the baby from the right side because of the lump.
He told me just to use the left side. That's the truth.
Finally, she went to a new doctor.
And he did the mammogram, and it showed cancer cells in both breasts.
She had to have a radical mastectomy.
I hate to say that I hated myself, but I hated my body. I felt for sure, even walking down the street, that people could see right through my blouse and knew.
If a woman has a lump and her doctor says you don't need a mammogram, what should she say?
She should say, I need a mammogram, I'm going to get a mammogram, and I want to go someplace where they do good mammography.
But given the risk of getting a bad mammogram, what should a woman do?
Ask if the mammography site is accredited through the American College of Radiology. If it is, you have a good assurance that the site is practicing top standards of mammography.
Yeah, because it looks a little fuzzy around the edges here.
This is an inspector in Michigan, the only state where facilities must by law meet the American College of Radiology standards. The law was passed to correct widespread abuses in mammography.
We found that 1/3 of the X-ray machines that we tested failed to meet the minimum imaging standards of the American College of Radiology.
In Michigan, only equipment like this designed solely for mammography can be used. All-purpose machines have been banned.
No one should be doing mammography with ordinary X-ray equipment.
But Dr. Hendricks says even the most modern equipment is not being checked or maintained properly.
In roughly 50% of the places, mammography sites, there's not adequate quality assurance going on.
And what about the people who operate the machines? In these 24 states, a person can operate one without a license and in some cases with only 1 hour's training.
Shouldn't a woman assume that places are certified and inspected and checked and that professionals are running the equipment?
No.
So where does that leave women?
For those of you now suspicious of the mammograms you've had, doctors say, get another. But even if you go to an accredited site with the most modern equipment, go armed with questions. Your life could depend on it. Michelle Gillen, NBC News, New York.
So to sum up what we have learned this week about breast cancer, mammograms are important and women should not hesitate to get them. They can save your life, but don't assume that every mammogram is a good one. The experts say that mammograms should not be taken on all-purpose X-ray machines. Also, you should ask whether your mammography facility has been approved by the American College of Radiology. To find an approved one, call 1-800-4-CANCER. That's the National Cancer Institute. And one final point, don't be afraid to ask questions. The women profiled in this series should remind you how important that is. Don't find yourself wishing that you had asked the question after it's too late. One of the most famous Cold War symbols, Checkpoint Charlie, was hauled away today to history. For almost 3 decades, the Allied border crossing stood on the west side of the Berlin Wall, but from now on, it will stand instead in a museum. And as NBC's Martin Fletcher reports tonight, the Allies were there to see it off.
For 29 years, Checkpoint Charlie embodied the Cold War. We meet here today to dismantle it and to bury the conflict that created it.
For symbolism, you couldn't beat it. Checkpoint Charlie coming in from the cold. The Americans, Soviets, Germans together as friends. It wasn't always like this. When Soviet and American tanks faced each other here, world peace was in the balance. The Soviets backed down, but Berlin stayed divided. Checkpoint Charlie became an icon of American culture, the damp, threatening view of the other side. Instead, today, the Soviets called for all foreign troops to leave German soil. The answer, no, a united Germany should decide. And nearby, Germans are deciding East German Army uniforms for sale.
2 for 1 mark. You want 2 of these?
1 mark, 50 pennies.
Almost 1/3 of the army has deserted, many selling their uniforms. Uniforms are symbols too, a sign of the times. The communist military threat is disappearing, its symbols for sale. Now there's a new challenge to keep the new Europe a place of peace. The 4 Allied foreign ministers and their 2 German counterparts then got down to business to work out the role of a united Germany in the new Europe. They didn't get very far, but meetings will continue to achieve German reunification this year. Back at what was once Checkpoint Charlie, it was a different confrontation for Soviet and American troops. Souvenirs.
And Checkpoint Charlie, history. That's the only thing I can say about it.
Martin Fletcher, NBC News, Berlin.
On Monday in this program, we'll begin a week-long series called One Germany. It will focus on the fears and the challenges posed by reunification. Among the questions, could this be the Fourth Reich? Back in this country, there was last-minute profit-taking on Wall Street today. That sent the Dow Industrials down sharply. Here is a late update on the Save the Donald Fund. You'll recall that earlier this week we told you about that mayonnaise jar in an Elizabeth, New Jersey diner dedicated to bailing out Donald Trump. Well, we can report tonight that contributions now are up to $45.23. And while Donald Trump is having a tough ride, so are a lot of other Americans on a new wave of roller coasters springing up across the country. NBC's George Lewis tells us tonight the roller coaster seems to be the ride of the 90s.
This is the Viper at California's Magic Mountain, the largest metal looping roller coaster in the world. and more Americans are taking the plunge these days because theme parks have discovered this is what the patrons want. Paul Rubin, editor of Roller Coaster Magazine.
Today's roller coasters are being built bigger, faster, wilder, and yet safer than ever before. For roller coaster enthusiasts, this is a glorious time to be alive.
Rubin says the last golden age of roller coasters was in the 20s, when there were more than 2,000 of them in North America. Only about 140 survived the Depression. Now the number is over 200, and the classic wooden coaster is making a big comeback. The tallest of those is the Texas Giant, which opened a couple of months ago in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Paul Rubin couldn't wait to climb aboard, and I went along for the ride.
That looks like some kind of drop.
All right, let's go.
Oh, my God! How do you like it so far?
Oh, incredible speed.
In his other life, Paul Rubin is an optical engineer. A 53-year-old professional suddenly turned into a little kid.
Why do you do this?
For the fun of it.
You think this is fun?
Well, 3,100 members of ACE, the American Coaster Enthusiasts, do call it fun. The organization is having its annual convention in Texas. Randy Giesler is the president.
This is a world-class roller coaster.
You think we're still ahead of the Japanese in this regard?
Oh, yeah, the Japanese don't even have any wooden roller coasters.
So, America, take pride. Our country may have had its ups and downs, but in the coaster department, we're still number one. George Lewis, NBC News, Arlington, Texas.
That's Nightly News for this Friday night. I'm Tom Brokaw. Gary Cutler will be here tomorrow night, and I'll see you again on Monday.